Have you ever asked yourself, why do you have a chronic blushing problem, whereas other people don't? Why is it that perhaps in a work meeting, when you're going to speak up, you get all hot and lobster red, but your colleagues are fine? Why is it perhaps when you're walking down the street and you bump into somebody you know, you go red and blush, whereas they're fine? If you've ever asked yourself, why is it you that has this problem and other people don't, then I hope that this video will give you some answers. My name is Madeleine de Hoek, and I used to suffer from erythrophobia, which is a phobic condition about fear of blushing. And I cured myself back in my 30s after going to medical school to understand the condition. And then I got on with my life and worked in Europe, in the Far East and the Middle East, and forgot about blushing. And it was only in 2022, at the end of 2022, when I made a TEDx talk called Stop Blushing and Speak Up to Unlock Your Potential, that people started contacting me. And now I also help people overcome their own blushing. So this video is to answer that question. Why me? Why not everybody? And here we go. I've got some slides and I'm going to walk us through this. So I don't pretend to have all the answers, but I do hope that this video will give you some answers, and hopefully you'll resonate with some of what I'm about to say. So the first thing to understand is that blushing is normal and blushing is human. Even Charles Darwin said that to blush is human. And you can see from this research done by a group of Swedish researchers that blushing comes up in all sorts of emotions, whether it's anger, whether it's fear, whether it's disgust. These are all heat maps that the researchers did. You can see that blushing is a normal emotional response. With us chronic blushers, it gets dysregulated, but the basic blushing response is normal. Every human being blushes. Now, perhaps for us, some of the most interesting ones, for example, the surprise blush. You can see it's in your face and your chest. And often people that I work with say, look, Madeleine, when I know that I'm going to be speaking, when I know I'm going to give a presentation, I'm okay because I can prepare for that. It's when something unexpected happens. Somebody asks me a question, or I see somebody I'm not expecting to see, that's when I blush. And you can see that surprise can create a blush. Let me just get back to that slide. Or shame. Down here, we can see it's in our face, our chest, and a bit of our stomach. And anxiety, that's mainly neck and chest and stomach, very little on the face. And again, some of the people I work with blushing, they don't blush on their face, they blush on their chest and their neck. So blushing is normal. With us chronic blushers, it gets dysregulated. Now, why is that? What happens when we can understand why? We can begin to understand how to unravel it all. So that's what we'll go through next. So what I believe is that there are two fundamental elements that are required together in order to create a blush response. So this is me or you. This is before we blushed, because we didn't always blush. And then life happens, and I'm going to go through each of these two fundamental elements in turn, and both of them together create a propensity to blush. So this is us now, where we blush. So element number one is the environmental conditions that you find yourself in. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's take a closer look. So maybe you have a genetic predisposition to blush. So I, for example, do have a genetic predisposition to blush. So let me just do a little experiment here. We'll see if it works. I'm just going to scratch myself here a bit, yeah, a bit. And we'll see if this works, if it shows up on camera. You can see I get very red. You can see where I haven't scratched myself. So if I eat spicy foods or I drink alcohol, I get very red. I've got a genetic predisposition to blush. Maybe you have blonde hair or red hair and fair skin, or dark hair and fair skin, or maybe you just have more dilation of your blood vessels and it shows up closer on your face. Maybe you have a genetic predisposition to blush. That on its own probably isn't enough to create chronic blushing, but when it's combined with other environmental factors, it all adds up. So people like me have a genetic predisposition to blush. Now, just because you have got genetics doesn't mean you can't get rid of your blush. I did. If I can, you can. So let's look at some of the other environmental factors that all add up to create this fertile ground, these environmental conditions. And that's part number one. So maybe there's genetics. Sorry, this isn't working. Maybe you're a highly sensitive person, HSP. A highly sensitive person is somebody who experiences environmental stimuli more at a deeper, more profound level than the rest of the population. So in the general population, about 20% of people are highly sensitive people. I believe that in those of us who blush, there are about 60 to 70% of people that are highly sensitive. So what does that look like? Well, perhaps the easiest is a story. So I can remember when I was pre-7, maybe 5, we used to have fireworks once a year in the village I grew up in. There were fireworks at the playground, and every year we would go and watch these fireworks. And every year I would scream and cry and run home crying because of the loud noises. It was just too loud for me. So when you're highly sensitive, stimuli are just too much. Maybe the lights are too bright and it gives you a headache. Maybe the music's too loud. Even if you love music, you need to tone it down. Maybe you drink coffee and it just makes your heart pump. There, I just noticed that. It just makes your heart pump too much. And you can't drink too much coffee, or you might even be very reactive to certain medications. So when you're highly sensitive, you experience things on a magnified level. And that becomes important in the second factor that's part of the blushing process. So maybe you've got a genetic predisposition, maybe you're highly sensitive, maybe, let's just go on, maybe you grew up feeling different in some way, or as a young adult you felt different. For example, I'm very tall and I grew up very tall, was very tall, and I felt different. My dad had a funny accent because he's Belgian. We lived in the UK. I felt different. Maybe you feel different for some reason. You might be shy, and so you're more sensitive when people speak to you. Maybe you have emotional inhibition. What do I mean by emotional inhibition? Well, that's as you're growing up, or even as you're older, you're not able to express your emotions. You're stopped for some reason. So I'm working with a young woman now. She's 30, and in our first session together, she was telling me that she's the second of 4 children, and her mum was pregnant with the 4th child, and there was the placenta was being disrupted, so that the mum had to be in bed. And this girl, as a young girl, she must have been about 4 or 5. She was being a child and wanted her mum's attention and was being loud, but her mum couldn't look after her because she was in bed and she had 3 other children. And so her grandmother took her to have a hot chocolate one day and said to her, look, Mary, we'll call her Mary, you've got to stop talking so much. You've got to stop making so much noise. You can't keep bothering your mum. So it's like, oh, Mary thought, okay, I can't speak. And then a couple of years later, Mary went to a very strict school. And again, you weren't allowed to talk at the cafeteria when it was lunchtime. Nobody was allowed to say anything. It was a very strict Catholic school. Nobody was allowed to speak. So again, she wasn't allowed to speak. It's emotional inhibition. And then later on, she went to a boarding school that was even stricter, and she wasn't allowed to speak. And so several little events in her life taught her that she wasn't allowed to express her emotions. So emotional inhibitions, she had to lock it in. She realized that was what was expected of her. So all these things can add up. So maybe you're introverted. Another person I'm working with, we'll call her Jane. She was shy and introverted growing up, and her mum was very extroverted, very social, and very loud and flamboyant with clothes and stuff. And so when they were from Spain, when they were speaking to her mum's friends, she was so flamboyant, or going in the shop, she was so loud and flamboyant. And Jane was always introverted and felt shy and embarrassed by her mum's behavior. So again, she felt kind of ashamed. So all these things can add up. They're totally normal life experiences, but they can all add up, and they create environmental conditions which are fertile ground for us if we're going to develop a blush response. Maybe you've grown up in a stressful environment, or you're naturally more stressed. Sorry, I just have to move something so I can see these. And maybe there are some other environmental conditions. Maybe you feel ashamed because of your emotional inhibition, because you're shy, because you're introverted, because you're different in some way. Another person I'm working with, his father was alcoholic, and so he felt ashamed and different because of that. And maybe you are socially isolated for whatever reason. You live in a rural community, or your parents are more socially isolated. All these things can add up to create these environmental conditions. Another person I worked with, their dad was very strict and sometimes violent. So again, that's emotional inhibition. He wasn't able to grow up expressing himself because his dad was very strict and might get violent if he expressed himself. So you've got these environmental conditions that create a fertile ground. Now, by themselves, those individual things, whether you're shy or introverted, or maybe you've got a genetic predisposition, by themselves, they're not enough. But add them together, and it creates very fertile ground to develop chronic blushing. And that, the first thing, coupled with the second condition, which is trauma. Sorry, I can't see because I've got my, which is the second condition is trauma. If you have those environmental conditions that create the fertile ground, and then you have a traumatic event in your life. Now let's have a look at what I mean by a traumatic event. So you can see there's a big jigsaw and there's a little jigsaw. So a traumatic event can be a big trauma. In my case, my mum committed suicide when I was 7. And I went to school the next day with my brother and sisters, and the teacher explained to the class that my mum had passed away. I can't remember exactly what she said, but anyway, the whole class turned around and looked at me. I was obviously traumatized by this terrible event that had happened. Everybody turned around to look at me, and that was a big trauma. I blushed, I froze, and from that moment on, anytime I felt I was the center of attention, I blushed and I froze. That's what created my erythrophobia for nearly 20 years. So it can be a big traumatic event, or it could be lots of small traumatic events. So maybe, this happened to me as well, maybe you've been asked to read in class, and it's embarrassing. I have dyslexia. I remember the first time I had to read in class, and everybody was laughing at me because I couldn't read, and I blushed then as well. That wasn't enough. But then I had a big traumatic event that solidified it. Or maybe you had lots of little traumatic events. One person I worked with, his teacher used to almost take pleasure in making him blush. And so every time he saw his teacher, the teacher would kind of do something or say something and almost enjoy the ability to create the blush in the student. So these are lots of small traumas. And those environmental conditions, number one, plus traumatic events, whether it's a big trauma with a capital T or lots of little traumas with a little t, those combined together create a stress response, and the body remembers that stress response. And our blush is basically a post-traumatic stress reaction. So that any time in your current day, in the current day life, you enter a situation that's anything like those traumatic events, whether it's you're the focus of attention because you're in the meeting and everybody's looking at you, whether it's an authority figure that you blush in front of, maybe it's your boss, or maybe it's good-looking members of the opposite sex, whatever it is, your trigger. And most of us have quite specific triggers. Some of them are more general triggers, but these triggers all point to the original wound, which is a big trauma or a small trauma combined with fertile ground because of our environmental conditions. So that's what happens. That's why I believe we blush. Our body remembers it, and the blush response is an automatic post-traumatic stress response whenever there's something that's just a little bit like that original trauma. So what can we do about that? How can we cure ourselves? How can we make ourselves better? Well, we can. So we can go backwards. We can heal our trauma. I've put them in light color here. They don't go away. Your trauma happened in the past, whether it was a big trauma or lots of little traumas. We can't wipe it out. It's part of you. It's part of who you are. And you can't undo your genetics. You can't undo your past, whether you had social isolation or dominating parents, or you weren't able to express your emotions very freely. Maybe a combination of this plus a death in the family or something that you experienced. These things happened, but we can desensitize them, we can heal them, we can learn to integrate them so that they no longer create that stress response in our body. It's a body-brain connection and a rewiring that we do. And that's why I've put this little flower here, because out of this pain and this trauma, I know it's hard to believe that when I'm telling you, because you're in the middle of the pain now. But if you're suffering from chronic blushing, believe me, I know what it's like. But out of all that, you can heal it. And there is some beauty that happens. There is a flower that blooms, and it makes you who you are, with all your complexity and all your beauty. And that becomes your gift, and you're able to then express your gift. So what I love to compare this to is the Japanese art of, I'm not going to pronounce it correctly, but kintsukuroi. It's basically where there is some beautiful pottery that's cracked or smashed, and they repair it with gold solder, pure gold or silver. And what they believe is when they repair these bowls, it's more beautiful now that it's repaired, now that it's healed. It's more beautiful because of the pain that it's been through than it was before when it was not broken. And that's what the healing journey of blushing is like. We can't remove the trauma. We can't remove the environmental conditions that you grew up in or that you experienced as a young adult. Some people start blushing when they're 5 or 6 or 7, some people in their teens, some in their early 20s, some even in their 30s. But it usually comes back to some sort of environmental condition and some sort of traumatic event. We can't remove that, but we can heal it. And when we begin to heal that, we desensitize the trauma and we can rewire the brain and the body-brain interaction so that you no longer get that automatic blush response. It's a little bit like Pavlov's dogs. You know Pavlov, he rang a bell and then he fed the dogs. He rang the bell, he fed the dogs. He rang the bell, he fed the dogs. And after a while, he could ring the bell and not feed the dogs, but they would still drool and salivate because they were expecting food. That's the same as our blush response. We get a trigger, some kind of trigger that makes us blush, rings the bell, and our body is so primed because of our lived experience that we blush sometimes even when we're not embarrassed, sometimes even when we're alone at home. But something reminds us of the initial wound, and we can desensitize that. Okay, so I hope that resonated with you. I hope that maybe gives you some insight that answers the question, why do I blush? Why do I have a chronic blushing problem and other people don't? Maybe you can see yourself in some of the environmental conditions that I talked about. Maybe you can see yourself in some of the traumatic examples that I gave. Everybody's different. Everybody's got their own unique life experience. But understanding that, I hope, gives you some insight, and that's the first step to healing. So whether you work with me and Blush to Bloom, or you work with a therapist in terms of understanding your trauma and desensitizing that body-brain connection, please know that it is possible to heal your blushing. It is possible to cure yourself. Your past does not dictate your future. There is hope. So hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you resonated with any of this. Let me know if you have some other thoughts on it. And see you soon in Blush to Bloom. Bye-bye.